Everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to give you some introductory notes about ancient Greek literature, since that is what we're starting with in our Western World Literature course. Yeah, but I also wanted to just give a brief sort of reflection on what is literature. How do we come up with these lists as far as what is great literature? Why this is a class built on our canon, right? Our literary canon. So why are works like William Shakespeare's Hamlet, or John Milton's Paradise Lost, or Dante's Inferno? Why do those books take such an important place in our culture? Why those books and not other books, right? There's lots of great books throughout history that have been forgotten about. Sometimes books have been rediscovered, decades or centuries after they first came out. For an example, Herman Melville's Moby Dick only sold 1,000 or so copies, during Melville's lifetime. Then centuries after, or not a century, but decades after his death, Melville was sort of rediscovered. Moby Dick has since become a piece of our American literary culture. So what makes literature literature? Well, one thing to consider is oftentimes literature is valued. So what makes someone classify something as literature? In a class like this, complexity is oftentimes seen as a great aesthetic trait, right? A work is great if it's complex. So is it complex? How is it complex? Is it complex in terms of character development, perhaps? Is it complex in terms of maybe acting within a great genre? Is it complex in the sort of major themes and ideas that it interrogates? So does a work, for instance, have a universal idea that will last throughout the centuries, right? So arguably something like Homer's Iliad does have that, right? We have, as you'll see next week when you read it, it has questions like, what are the futility of war, right? That's a theme. Our role within the larger universe, right? Are we free, or are we puppets of the gods? Right? These sorts of major questions, the more a piece of literature can sort of make us reflect on that, perhaps that makes it literature. Ambiguity is also a sort of trait to consider. Oftentimes great literature, people argue, doesn't have clear-cut answers, right? Oftentimes even with the way the story is told. So perhaps an ending, might not come together so nicely, right? Maybe the ending of a work is kind of messy. Right? Maybe there's questions left, after we're done reading the text. One of the great pieces for this will be our first comedy we read, Aristophanes' Lysistrata, as we'll see in a few weeks. That I'm not going to go too deep into it, but that play has an ending. Sure, it's a comedy, so it's a happy ending, but it's oftentimes debated. People love it because is the happy ending really that happy for the women in the play, or are they sort of still left in the lurch? So that's a trait that's often seen as making for great literature. Complexity, ambiguity. You might ask yourself, well, why are some things called trash, right? Why are some things called trash? You might say, well, The best example of this is think about those sort of romance novels you would see that cost like $3 or $4 a piece, right? That you might find at a store like Magic Mart or Walmart. In that section, they always have the cowboy on the cover, right, seducing the woman. Why aren't those works great works of literature? Well, arguably they're commercial. They tell the same story over and over and over. Perhaps the writing isn't complex enough, right? Even some stuff that is popular, like let's say Harry Potter, right? Why is Harry Potter not really considered literature with a capital L? Well, good question. They arguably a children's book. Well, does that not make it literature? So these are the questions we're kind of always asking ourselves in as English professors. Why is a work great? So this is a question that you can also ask yourself the further we go through the semester. So I just wanted to quickly reflect on that in this video. But the main topic at hand for this video is the ancient Greeks. Right, we are introducing ourselves to the ancient Greeks as far as a starting point for Western world culture. So I did a little bit. I refreshed myself on this before I made this video. But if you think about the Western world, think about it cutting off sort of at the Middle East. Right, you cut it off at the Middle East. Everything west of the Middle East is almost the Western world. So whenever we think about the Western world, it's mostly ancient Greece and ancient Rome that has the great works of literature. If you look at our anthology, there's actually a work from ancient Sumeria that has made it to us to this day, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Right, but for the most part, everything that we have has made it through the Greeks, the Greek language, the Roman, the Latin language. So a lot of these ancient cultures struggled with coming up with actually writing things down. Some of these cultures, like the Egyptians, they had the hieroglyphics. They kept records and wrote things down. But they didn't necessarily write down a lot of their stories so much, a lot of their myths, like the Greeks did. The Greeks adapted the Sumerian vocabulary. They added the contribution of adding vowels into the Sumerian alphabet. Which kind of helped give us our alphabet that we have today, that we take for granted. Ancient Greeks had their own alphabet. The Latin language shares their alphabet, though. Like if you read something in the Latin language, it has the same alphabet as English for the most part, except there's no W in Latin. The W sound is with a V. Just a random digression. So it was really the Greeks. The Greeks got these ancient Egyptian paper, the papyrus, and that is when things started getting written down and kept. So what we are starting with in the course is Homer's Iliad. Of course, you guys also might know Homer's Odyssey. Well, we don't really know a lot about Homer per se. Homer might not have actually been a real person. The Iliad comes from an oral storytelling tradition, right? Before literature actually did start getting written down. So they didn't have Netflix in 2800 BCE, right? So how did they entertain themselves? Well, maybe 2800 BCE is too far back. But you might ask, how did they entertain themselves? Well, oral storytelling was how they did it. You know, they would tell these long, elaborate stories, often about their gods, right? You know, and they would become this sort of public performance where everybody would sort of gather together and hear the orator, you know, the orator memorized these long epic poems, and that's how that story got told over and over and over through the generations. So you can imagine that when something is told that way, new facts get added to it all the time. Maybe new embellishments get added to it. So eventually, the story that comes up that is eventually written down might not even be the same story that came about originally. So that is something to consider. So a little bit about the Greeks as a people. You know, who were they? What made them tick? Of course, if you look at a map, Greece is surrounded by mountains. You know, that kind of helped give the Greeks. That kind of helped separate different Greek peoples from each other. So the Greeks often organized themselves into different sort of city nations, city states. Each city state had its own government. So, of course, the two most popular city states were Athens and Sparta. Sparta, as you know, was the more militaristic city state. Athens was where the idea of the democracy first came up. You know, of course, it was democracy for a very select few. You know, just mostly just rich male landowners, right? You know, the ancient Greeks did most of their work. You know, they had slaves who did most of their work. Unlike in the Americas, when the Americans adapted slavery and it was mostly built on race, the ancient world slavery was an institution, but it wasn't necessarily built on race. Like oftentimes, if the land was conquered, they would take the people to become their slaves, for instance. So race and slavery weren't necessarily intertwined in the ancient world. Sometimes it was probably, but that wasn't what built who should be a slave or not. But a lot of the menial tasks, of course, you guys think that they really didn't have machines like they do today. So a lot of the menial hard work slaves did. You know, they didn't. Women did not hold a lot of power in the ancient world. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Greece or Rome in this case. You know, the ancient Greeks especially were pretty misogynistic, right? They treated women, they kept women down, right? This is where the patriarchal cultures sort of first emerged. You know, so it was mostly the man who was to be the head of the household. You know, women were mostly kept in at all times in the ancient Athenian city-state. They didn't have any rights necessarily. You know, oftentimes women were really just used for procreation. You know, homosexuality was pretty widely accepted actually in the ancient Greek, in the ancient Roman world. It was often, you know, oftentimes the wife was just there for procreation, and the man would have a lover, another male lover, or a younger boy lover. So that women are very often, you know, sort of kept down. You know, so this is something to think about as you read through some of our literature. Right? What are the role of women in some of these ancient Greek texts? Are women looked down on? Can you not trust women? And so one of the play that I mentioned, Lysistrata, it's actually a tongue-in-cheek play about women stop putting out because they want to end the war between the Athenians and the Spartans. So that is, that is something to consider. But the ancient Greeks, they developed a lot of like what we consider as government today. They invented philosophy, right? You had character figures like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Those philosophers helped create the foundations of what a lot of our knowledge is today. Especially Aristotle. He came up with all the different branches of science, so biology, chemistry, physics, as well as rhetoric, the poetics. Aristotle sort of was one of the first people to help categorize knowledge into different disciplines, just like it is today. And so we're not really going to read a lot of philosophy. That's a task for philosophy class. But the ancient Greeks innovated in that regard. But as far as literature goes, we have the epic poems, which we're starting with. The ancient Greeks helped to develop the drama, right? So once we start talking, we'll talk more in depth in the future, but especially Greek tragedy becomes its own sort of genre. We have like only so many have made it to us through the centuries. We're going to read two of the great ones, Oedipus the King and Medea. Medea is going to be an interesting play to read, thinking about the role of women in the Greek world. But also they innovated the comedy as well, as we will see. So the Greek drama was a major genre on top of epic poetry and storytelling. They also helped innovate lyric poetry. We're not going to read any, but the poet Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos, right, was her themes were in her poetry are very much sort of homoerotic, right? Her love for other women. And of course, that's where the island of Lesbos is where that word comes from. So they were very much a different people than what we are today, right? A lot of the values that they held were not even the values depended on the different city states, right? But a lot of things that were taboo to our modern cultures were not to them, right? Like sexuality. So very much a different sort of world. The reason why a lot of ancient Greek lit has made it to us today, we can also owe to the contributions of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was from Macedon, which was a city-state in the northern part of Greece. Well, his father started the war. His father Philip started the wars, but they conquered all of Greece, and then they pretty much conquered all of what we think of as the Western world today. So in the centuries after he passed, this culture sort of spread out and bloomed and blossomed. All the way. So Greek culture spread all the way from Italy, right, all the way west as Egypt, even France and England. So this ancient Greek culture just spread. The alphabet spread. When the alphabet spread, the written language spread. The books started circulating. By the time of the ancient Romans, one of the greatest libraries in the world was in Alexandria in Egypt. Of course, the Library of Alexandria actually burnt down. You know, so you might even ask yourself, well, think about all the books that were written that were now lost because that might have been one of the only one or two copies of the book that was written down. Books had to be written. You know, someone actually had to sit down and write the book. There was no printing press to write the books. So that's one reason why a lot of works haven't made it to us. There wasn't wide circulation of books. But thanks to Alexander conquering the Western world, that's almost the reason why we even have Western lit, because he helped spread the alphabet, to creating written language. So, but eventually, by 200 BCE or so, another nation emerges, which is, of course, the Romans. Before I talk about the Romans, let me briefly mention also Greek religion. Right, as we shall see, the Greeks, the Greek gods, the Greek myths, they have made it to us today. Gods like Zeus and Poseidon and Athena, and I'm thinking of Rome, Ares. Lots of these Greek, Apollo, all these different Greek gods are still part of our culture today. But the Greeks were a polytheistic religion, meaning they believed, of course, in more than one god. When the Hebrew religion formed Judaism, the belief that there's only one God, that is called monotheism, right? The belief in just one God and not many gods. The Greeks believed in many gods. Unlike something like modern Christianity, religion didn't really form how people acted. It didn't really create their value system so much. For the most part, these Greek gods were indifferent. They weren't really friends to humanity so much. Oftentimes, as you shall see, especially in the Iliad, we are just pawns to the gods' larger games that they play with each other. So the Iliad is about the Trojan War, the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. The Trojans are the city of Troy was said to be somewhere around where modern Turkey is. But the Trojan War, the myth is actually that the war starts because the ancient Greek, the three of the Greek goddesses, Hera, who was Zeus's wife, right? Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, the goddess of sex and beauty, all had a competition. They wanted a mortal to say which among them was the most desirable. Well, they went to this sort of yokel farmer dude named Paris, and they asked him, which of us is the most desirable? Of course, Paris, being a true man, picked Aphrodite, right? The most beautiful of the gods, of the goddesses. She, in turn, rewarded him with the most beautiful woman in the world, who was Helen of Troy, right? But Helen was married to a Greek king. So what happened in turn was that Greek king felt gypped, and that helped cause the Trojan War. So as you see the irony there, the goddess rewarded Paris, but it had dire consequences. But they couldn't be bothered with those consequences, right? We are just pawns in their larger game. As you'll see when you read it, different gods take different sides in the war. Hera, Zeus's wife, is very much on the Greek side. Apollo, the sun god, is very much on the Trojan side, right? So we are all sort of pawns in their larger game. But I bring this up before the Romans because the Romans actually borrowed pretty much everything from Greek culture, including their gods. Right? The Romans adapted, those gods, but they just renamed them. So Zeus pretty much became Jupiter, um, for instance. That is, Mars, the god Ares became Mars. Those are two I know right off the top of my head. The Mercury was Hermes, the messenger god. I'll double check that. I might be wrong. But so they just renamed everything and tried to make it Roman pretty much. So as you'll see over the coming weeks, when we do get to the Romans, we'll see how they kind of appropriated Greek culture to sort of enmesh it within theirs. But again, with the Romans, once they did get their culture going, it spread across the whole Western world because the Roman Empire conquered most of the known world. But it didn't quite make it to China, into the Eastern world, or India, but they made it pretty far. And so, and oftentimes, as you'll see in this course, it's oftentimes called the fall of Western civilization almost, but around 500 or 600, AD. Of course, by that time, Christianity had swept over Rome and become the official religion of Rome. But by the time that came about, the Roman Empire kind of fell apart. Right, there was invasions from the sort of barbarians, like Attila the Hun, for instance. And once that sort of centralized empire fell apart, that was it almost for Western culture. People, the main sort of culture was the church, so there really wasn't a need to go read Greek tragedies or philosophy anymore. People were too busy working difficult jobs on the farms all day. They didn't have time for culture for a long time. So that is when we'll get to the medieval era, which we'll talk about more in several weeks. That's not to say that there wasn't a lot of great culture in the medieval era. It just wasn't inspired by, the Greek culture so much. Later, when they had a Renaissance where they sort of rediscovered a lot of these old Greek and Roman texts. So that is the main thing to take away from this. Know about the Greeks and their values, their religion, the way they treated women. Both the Greeks and the Romans had slaves. Romans had slightly different values than Greeks. Romans were very militaristic and proud. Right? So you'll get lots of good context if you read that introduction on top of this video that I've provided for you. But hopefully this gives you a good foundation to get us started. I hope you found this interesting. And we will see you for the next video, which shall be on Homer's Iliad. Until next time.